as a response to John's paper, I'm mainly going to focus on two issues that he puts forward in order to address the democratic deficit in global governance. That is the discrepancy between the increasing development of transnational institutions with great economic and political power and the lack of democratic mechanism to control them, over them. So John defends the idea that deliberative democracy as a specific but dominant interpretation of the deliberative ideal can give us new concepts and new ideas of legitimacy, accountability, and governance, which would be much more relevant for global governance than a more traditional, classical, or liberal concept of accountability and legitimacy. It's worth noting that it is, in a sense, quite a bold move, because one of the main criticisms which has been addressed to deliberative democracy in recent years is precisely its alleged inability to address mass politics, because its focus is so much on face-to-face exchange of arguments, deliberation within small groups. It has been very often deemed unable to address in a satisfying way politics on a regional, national, or even global scale. So confronted with this challenge, deliberative democrats have usually followed two separate ways. On the one hand, some theorists have advocated the use of representative mini-publics. They have a tremendous advantage. They allow for a close monitoring of the deliberation, of the discussions, and they make it much more likely that discursive exchanges between non-partisan ordinary citizens will actually have a deliberative form. The pitfall then is that either they completely lack decision-making powers, which make them look all but superfluous, or they do have actual decision-making powers. But then we need to account for how it comes that it is legitimate for them, for non-elected, for small groups of non-elected citizens, to make decisions that are binding for all citizens on a national scale, for instance. The other way which has been followed has consisted in trying to extend, as John just described, the very concept of deliberation to various forms of discursive exchanges, both formal and informal, within civil society, in NGOs, transnational associations, and so on and so forth, so that we could have some kind of a network or networks of deliberative public sphere on a great scale. The pitfall then is that what we risk to have is the dilution of the concept of deliberation and the dilution of the kind of epistemic and fairness quality it is supposed to ensure. So what I take John to be trying to do is to go both ways and to connect, in this case around the instance of climate change, a very original proposal for a mini-public, the Deliberative Global Citizens Assembly, which is presented as superior to alternative proposals relying on election, like a popularly elected global assembly, and a much more structured idea of what a general deliberative society, or in this case, deliberative system could be. So this is a very exciting proposal, but for the sake of discussion, and because I'm not entirely convinced, I will mostly put forward objections to two claims, which I take to be the main central claims in John's talk. First, the claim that this deliberative global citizens assembly is superior to a form of more traditional, popularly elected global assembly with regard with solving or helping to solve the democratic deficit. Second, the claim that a deliberative system that would satisfy all the conditions which John just identified would somehow guarantee or ensure that global governance is legitimate and rational enough, and maybe even instrumental to justice. So first of all, regarding the deliberative global citizens assembly, it is said to be preferable to a popularly elected global assembly on two accounts. First, because it would give voice to a representative sample of non-elected ordinary citizens, and thus help address the democratic deficit. And second, because it would bypass elections on a national level or even on a transnational level. So I'm going to address these two arguments, but first a question. What would be the exact power, the exact decision-making role of such an assembly? In a recent paper that deals with this proposal, John and his co-author argue that we do not need to take yet a specific stance regarding what kind of power should be endowed to such an assembly. We don't need yet to take a position on the function it would have in relation with other already existing institutions. But I don't see how we can dodge or postpone that question and still try to compare a popularly elected assembly and a non-elected one. Because if the deliberative Global Citizens Assembly is assumed to have only an advisory role, there's probably very, very little that could be said against it. But then, it cannot exactly compare to a traditional form of elected assembly, and yet again, it might only seem to be a minor innovation. On the other hand, if on the contrary, it can make decisions on specific issues such as climate change or maybe financial regulation that could be binding for all sovereign states, one needs to account for what grounds exactly its legitimacy. Two features are usually invoked, and John refers to both of them, to legitimate that kind of experiments or devices. First, they allow for more rational deliberation because they involve ordinary citizens who are less likely to be partisan and because they can be closely monitored. Second, they allow for a specific form of representativeness because they include citizens who constitute, by random selection, a representative sample of the population, of the citizenry. But both arguments can be criticized, and I would suggest that these criticisms gain a very specific strength when we go to the global level. So first, the monitoring of the debate and the random selection of citizens who have not been trained previously on the issue, or who have not educated themselves on the issue previously, mean that all the advantages of political knowledge, political skills, political relations that citizens who are involved in activism, ongoing political activities actually acquire on the issues that they are interested in. Which means that the participants in such an assembly would have to be formed on the specific issue being under discussion during the experiment or during the assembly, during the process. And because of that, the way the issue is framed, the way the options are presented, makes it much more, cannot be as easily revised as in a normal, ongoing process. Second, the idea that of statistical representativeness of a group of individuals is a contestable ground for political representation. But there's a specific issue here, which is that it's difficult to see how a 1,000-person assembly could constitute a satisfying representative sample of a population of almost 7 billion inhabitants. So what kind of satisfying representativeness of the cultural, religious, philosophical, and political diversity that we are aiming at could we obtain? Then, regarding the second argument, and I'll skip the part about the deliberative system, the weight of the argument for this assembly seems to rest mostly on the idea that it bypasses elections. But how is this a good thing? A first argument is that it solves the United States and the China problem, because there would be, the states would not be challenged by a non-elected institutions, which would be a direct equivalent of their own elected national institutions, and China would not have to organize national elections they do not want to organize. But this only seems to hold, I believe, if this assembly has strictly an advisory role. It's very difficult to see how they could easily accept, even if non-elected, a body of citizens endowed with the power of make binding decisions, of making decisions that are binding even for them. elected or non-elected. And then there's a bigger question of the second argument about the traditional pitfalls of transnational elections. People don't have a very clear idea of what is at stake. They don't know very well the issues. They tend to use their vote as an expressive device without considering the specific stakes. And so the argument is that because people do not have the kind of, cannot make the kind of political judgments that would make a transnational election rational or efficient, we should completely bypass it. Well, first of all, it's a grim assessment, which does not mean it might not be accurate. But even if it's accurate, how is this not also undermining the proposal for a global deliberative citizens' assembly? Because it would mean that the world citizens could not evaluate the quality of the results put forward by the assembly. They could not evaluate the quality of the work done by the members of the assembly. And so the idea that by bypassing completely the political judgment of most world citizens, we would somehow promote we would solve or contribute in solving the democratic deficit seems rather counterintuitive. How should citizens deem legitimate the result of a process in which they did not participate, but also on issues on which they are supposed not to have any actual grasp, in a process including people with whom, they have played absolutely no role, not even the usual minuscule role we have in elections in selecting. On the contrary, if this picture of citizens' abilities is too grim, and if they are able to make up informed enough political judgment about the result of such a process, what is at stake in climate change, what is at stake in financial regulation, in precise enough a way to have an opinion informed that allow them to deem that this particular assembly made a good job, or that it did not, that it was legitimate, or that it was not, then why are they not also competent enough to select the members of the assembly? Okay, I'll skip the questions about the deliberative system.